Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. I am Rosara Estrella from the Marketing Department. Just some housekeeping items before we start. All phones will be placed on mute to help with hearing the presentation. There will be a question and answer period at the end of the presentation, so please write your questions down in the chat box in your control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We're happy to have today Dr. Nancy Frey. She's going to be presenting on the topic of closed reading. Dr. Frey is a professor of literacy in the School of Teacher Education at San Diego State University. She is also a classroom teacher at Health and Science High and Middle College. Dr. Frey is the recipient of an Early Career Achievement Award from the National Reading Conference and a co-recipient of the Krista McAuliffe Award for Excellence in Teacher Education from the American Association of State College and Universities. Nancy has co-authored many professional books and articles and is the core author of the Sadlier vocabulary program, Vocabulary for Success. Nancy, welcome, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Rosara, can you also confirm, too, that everyone can see my screen before I go?
Sure. I'm pretty sure they can see you.
Okay, perfect. Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you. This is the fourth in a four-part series that my colleague Doug Fisher and I have done with Sadlier in looking at the Common Core State Standards through the lens of vocabulary development and the literacy practices that go with that. As you know, vocabulary is not simply memorizing a list of words. Vocabulary really is a proxy, if you will, for how it is that students represent their thinking, their understanding of concepts, the skills that they engage in, and so on.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
In the language of the Common Core Standards, they talk about specifically words and phrases. This idea that vocabulary really is embedded into the language of how it is that we represent our thinking, both verbally as well as in writing, is central to what happens across those Common Core standards. And close reading is certainly a part of those literacy practices that help to develop that vocabulary knowledge as well as reading and writing knowledge and the ability to be able to communicate effectively. So I'm going to show you a big scary chart with lots of numbers all over it. I imagine that you've seen this chart before. This is from the developers of the Common Core and has really been both a contentious part of the Common Core as well as something that people are paying attention to in lots of good ways. One of the chief changes that happened with the development and the dissemination of the Common Core standards was this idea of raising the level of text complexity that students are expected to be able to read and understand across the grade levels. And you may know that the way that that was developed was in looking first. There were a series of studies that were done back in the mid-2000s that identified a gap between what high school seniors were able to do and what college freshmen were expected to be able to do in terms of their reading. And in an effort to close that gap, those expectations have been raised and there's been this backward planning. And so we've seen an expansion of what that looks like. As you probably know, in kindergarten and first grade, when it comes to these quantitative measures, we don't even talk about that because it's not appropriate to look at quantitative measures for that type of text. The same thing would apply as well to poetry, regardless of the level of complexity, because it just defies those sorts of measurements. But as we go into grade 2 and beyond, there are these quantitative measures that are present. The original released lexiles, which are in the second column, were released, and there was some criticism about all of those. One area of criticism came from people who are primary teachers, primary educators, who said, you know, it's all well and good that you want to raise the level, but when the first step is so very high, we worry about the ability to be able to get students up that first step and moving up that staircase, so to speak. Another area, another place of criticism were among people who think about students who are working well above grade level, both students formally identified as talented and gifted, as well as students who are just really well beyond what we think of as being at grade level. And they expressed concerns that the upper limits of those ranges would limit what it was that teachers felt that they could do. And so in an effort to address these criticisms, the figures were revised at the end of 2011. That's the third column. And if you compare what it looked like in 2010 versus 2011, you'll notice that there's been a widening of those ranges. The lower limit is lower, and the upper limit is higher along the way in an effort to accommodate a broader range of learners within a grade level. The remaining columns that are there are the product of a series of quantitative studies that were done in order to be able to align various other measurement systems so that regardless of the measurement system that you're looking at, you can understand and transpose where those numbers come from, because obviously not everything in the world is measured by lexiles. So those are the quantitative measures. That's one way that we can look at text. But anybody would tell you that looking at quantitative measures alone is completely inadequate. Quantitative measures, by and large, are a way of being able to identify in a very preliminary kind of way if you're about in the right area in terms of a grade band. In other words, is this, for example, a grade 6 to 8 text? Well, quantitative measure is a preliminary way of being able to say, yeah, I think we're at about the middle school level. But you have to look beyond those quantitative measures. They're simply inadequate to be able to do that alone. And so what you also have to do is you have to look at those qualitative measures. And these qualitative measures are really what resonate with all of us as teachers. The developers identified 4 broad areas to consider when looking at the qualitative values that a piece of text has to offer. Levels of meaning, language convention and clarity, knowledge demands, and structure. And all of those, and you'll see, you can see as the figure is expanded out, all of those speak to various ways in which a piece of text can be considered, relatively speaking, more or less complex. I'll use as an early elementary example, for instance, in the area of language convention and clarity. You'll notice that one of the values that's there is around the use of standard English and variations. Now, I work in a community, I'm in San Diego. I work in a community that is about 20 miles from the border with Mexico, and in a community that locally is very diverse. We have students from all over the world that live in this neighborhood. It's a wonderful place to be, but it also brings with it some challenges in the classroom in terms of what students know and understand in terms of standard English and variations. There's a wonderful book that I would put at the 2nd or 3rd grade level called Saving Sweetness. And Saving Sweetness, if you're not familiar with it, has the dialogues, the narrator, it has a very strong West Texas cowboy twang to his language. And for children who are not familiar with that dialect, that book is going to be a little bit more complicated for them. So I have to take into consideration what it is that's happening with my students, what is it that they bring to the text, and what some complications can be. As well, and I'll use one other example, and that's around the issue of structure. Various structures can make a piece of text more difficult or less difficult. I'll use a high school example. Edgar Allan Poe's short stories have a narration that is more complex. Poe was the person who brought to us, or who invented, if you will, the idea of the unreliable narrator. In other words, that what it is that the narrator is telling you in the story cannot be fully believed. He invented that literary device. If a student isn't familiar with that idea of the unreliable narrator, then he or she is going to miss many of the subtleties and nuances that happen in many of the Poe stories. So we have to take into consideration what those qualitative values are in a piece of text. This is really where the teacher comes into play. When we talk about quantitative measures, for example, we're talking about things that a computer can do. But when we're talking about qualitative values, those are things that only a human can do. And in this case, a human, a teacher or an educator, somebody who has the skills, the deep skills, to be able to understand what those qualitative values are. Now, I used as two examples pieces of narrative text, but the same things apply when we're talking about informational text as well. For instance, a graphic in a science textbook at the middle school level, those graphics that are in there are incredibly complex. They're not just colorful ways of breaking up the text. They're laden with information. And students' ability to be able to understand that diagram can make a piece of text more or less complex. These qualitative values, and the reason why I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on them, are so important to us, because here's where our teaching points are. When we can look at a piece of text and figure out qualitatively what makes that text more complex, it gives us insight into what our teaching points need to be. In other words, I don't need to spend a lot of time teaching about some aspect of the text that I don't find to be particularly complex. I do need to concentrate my efforts on those qualitative values that I've identified as being more complex. That's where I want my teaching to lie. And in all of these cases, although we call out vocabulary specifically within knowledge demands, vocabulary is really laden in all of these, whether we're talking about figurative language. That's all about vocabulary. Whether we're talking about density, especially. Density refers to the fact that there are these idea units, and more dense text, more complex sentences that have more ideas in them, in other words, more challenging vocabulary, are going to be more difficult for students. Vocabulary plays a role when we're talking about standard English and its variations and the registers that are used, especially when we're talking about connotation versus denotation. How do we look at the various registers that two characters might be addressing each other? Is this an intimate relationship? Is this a very formal and distant relationship? Well, it's the vocabulary in part that gives us insight into all of that. So I hope that I've kind of made the argument that vocabulary especially is not just understanding a list of words, but rather that it's embedded in virtually everything that we do whenever we read and write and talk with one another. So going back to the Common Core, looking at those complex pieces of text. They talk about the quantitative values, in other words, the measures that a computer can do, and the qualitative values, what you bring to the text in terms of your knowledge. The final dimension in taking a piece of text into consideration is thinking about the task demand and the reader, what it is that the reader knows. So over on the left-hand side of your screen, the quantitative and qualitative values are relatively fixed in terms of how it is that you look at a piece of text. But then we have to take the reader and the task into play as well. The reader brings his or her levels of motivation and knowledge and experience, as well as their cognitive capabilities. And in the same regard, there's a task that you have linked to that piece of text. As a teacher, I can make any task or any book or any text infinitely more or less complicated depending on the task that I match it up to. If it's a teacher-led task, I'm providing comparatively a lot of scaffolding that goes along with that. If it's a peer-led task, now we're dropping down the scaffolding just a bit, and we're allowing peers to be able to support one another. If it's an independent task, now we've essentially removed almost all of the scaffolding, and students have to rely on their own skills to be able to do that. This is such an important consideration in thinking about the kinds of complex text that you bring into your classroom and then what it is that you do with them. In no way should there ever be any understanding at all that complex text is simply about filling out a book order, getting lots of hard books in your classroom, passing them out to students, and then saying, you know, good luck to you. We'll have a test on this in 4 weeks, and off you go. We have to always think about the scaffolding that's involved with all of that. We also have to think about how those three factors all interplay with one another as well. I can focus on a piece of text that qualitatively is tremendously complex, but quantitatively is a bit lower. And I would use poetry as an example of that. Quantitatively, generally poems are not all that difficult to be able to decode. You're not going to run into a lot of big words in most poems, but the qualitative factors, what it is that that poem represents, can be incredibly complex. There's a reason why Emily Dickinson's poems are considered to be classics today, because of those qualitative factors. To be able to read them is comparatively very easy, but it's the qualitative aspect of it that's very difficult. As well, I have to think about the task demands that are going on. When I'm using a more complex piece of text, qualitatively and quantitatively, when I'm using a more complex piece of text, I have to ramp up the scaffolding. In other words, that's when I'm using a close reading approach. I'd like for you to think about close reading as a form of guided instruction, not guided reading, guided instruction. In other words, that this is a teacher-led task with lots of scaffolding, lots of support that's going on. Close reading is not simply giving them a difficult piece of text and wishing them the best. You as a teacher are providing a tremendous amount of support in order to be able to do so. So let's talk about close reading for a few minutes. And then what I'm going to share with you are the outcomes and the findings of a study that we conducted here with close to 150 students, ninth graders, here at our school around close reading. But first, let's talk about what some of the conditions are that make it a close reading and not another form of reading. I love this quote from Adler and Van Doren. This book has been around forever. Many of you may know it. You may recall it from your own college experiences. It's called How to Read a Book, and incredibly valuable in terms of thinking about how it is that you foster deep levels of comprehension with the narrative or informational text that you're using in your classroom. And Adler and Van Doren said every book has a skeleton hidden between its covers. Your job as an analytic reader is to find it. And this idea that with complex pieces of text, that there really are these opportunities to be able to analyze them closely, that's really at the heart of what happens with close reading. When we talk with our students, we don't actually use that quote. We simply tell them that we're going to x-ray the book. In other words, we're going to find the bones of the book. We have to look closely. We can't just look quickly at a piece of text. This is a piece of text that I've identified as a teacher as being something that we want to pay closer attention to. It's also important to note that not every reading that you have in your classroom is worthy of a close reading approach. There are lots of readings that all of us do in our classrooms that are kind of those one and done sorts of readings. Just to get the information, a surface level of comprehension is fine, and then we're going to move on from all of that. If we spent time doing close reading with every piece of text that ever moved in front of a child's eyes, we'd never get anything else done. But when we're talking about those more complex pieces of text that are necessary in whatever discipline we teach, those are the kinds of close readings that we're looking at. One of the areas of concern regarding close reading and a place certainly where there's been lots of conversation is around the role of pre-reading. For 30 years, I have to tell you, we have certainly gotten the message that you have to build a lot of background knowledge, you have to do a lot of pre-reading, you have to spend a lot of time on all of that. But the challenge around pre-reading is that you have to be careful not to remove the reason for the student to read the text in the first place. I never thought that I did this, and when I started paying attention to my own practice, I realized that in many cases I was. In an effort to be able to pre-teach all the vocabulary, build all the background knowledge, and oh, by the way, give them an overview of what the text was about, I had actually removed the reason for them to read it in the first place. When I'm doing a close reading, I'm going to drop down the amount of pre-reading that I'm doing. Now, as I said, there are pieces of text that we all use that are one and done. We're going to read it one time, and we're going to move on through it. I probably need to spend a little bit more time on pre-reading in those situations. But when I'm doing a close reading, I can drop down the amount of pre-reading that I do because those multiple readings are going to actually accomplish the same thing. So I am definitely, just to be clear, I am definitely not one of those people that's saying, oh, don't do any pre-reading at all. That nothing can be further from the truth than that at all. But when I'm doing a close reading and I'm providing a lot of scaffolded instruction, I don't need to do as much pre-reading because of that scaffolded instruction that happens during the close reading. As well, I want to make sure that I'm not removing the whole reason for them to read the book in the first place. I'll give you a kindergarten example of this because I think that's something that all of us on one level or another can relate to. I have seen picture walks that take 15 or 20 minutes to do. that's too much pre-reading. The idea of a picture walk for a very young child, for an emergent reader, the idea of a picture walk is simply to be able to give them something of a frame cognitively to be able to understand the story. It is not to retell the whole story in advance of them ever reading it. So we have to be careful about the judicious use of pre-reading. I'm going to offer a couple of exceptions to that as well. You have students who are English learners, you're going to spend a bit more time on pre-reading because you do need to build the language. Think about the language demands. Remember that one of the things that we consider is the reader. If you have students who are still learning English and they're learning in English at the same time, you're going to do more pre-reading. For some students with disabilities or students who are more struggling readers, again, you're probably going to spend a little bit more time on the pre-reading than you might with other students as well. So in the same way that we can differentiate and move those factors up and down qualitatively and quantitatively and so on, pre-reading can also serve that function as well. My caution, though, is that when you're doing close reading, don't take away the whole reason for them to read in the first place. So let's talk about creating a close reading and what some of the conditions are for that. Typically, a close reading uses a short passage, and there's a practicality to that as well. One of the reasons it uses a short passage in most cases is because you don't want to run out of time. You want to be able to get through that particular reading. So again, you're going to take into consideration what your student's stamina is in terms of both reading as well as being able to persist with a piece of text. And it doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that close readings can only be confined to a close or to a short piece of text that is complete in any way. You can and you should be doing close readings with longer pieces of text too. For example, most social studies textbooks have primary source documents or excerpts of primary source documents that are available right there in the textbook. Those are perfect opportunities to be able to do a close reading. You're not going to do a close reading on the entire textbook, but you can pick out a passage, pull out that primary source information, because that is probably more complex, and have them focus on that. In terms of narrative, I'm not going to do a close reading of the entire play Hamlet, but there are certain aspects of that play, those real key turning points where I do want to do a close reading. I want to pull that out. We just did To Kill a Mockingbird, so I'll use that as an example. I didn't do a close reading of the entire book To Kill a Mockingbird, but some really key points. For example, whenever the trial happens, we did a close reading of that. When Jem and Scout first encountered Boo Radley at the beginning of the story, near the beginning of the story, we did a close reading of that passage. The students didn't know at the time why we were doing so, but we know as readers of that book that that's a really key scene. So that was an opportunity for me to really put a spotlight on all of that. So that's what we mean by using a short passage. It doesn't have to be complete as a short passage, but you can pull out of longer documents the areas that you want to spotlight. We also talk with students all the time about reading with the pencil, annotating the text. We know that in many cases they can't write directly in the book, and don't tell my principal, but that's what the photocopier is for. Times when I can photocopy a portion of text, again remembering that it's a short passage, so very often, you know, it's 1 or 2 pages in length. and I have them write directly on there. In other cases, I know that sometimes people have students write on stickies, or they have bookmarkers of one kind or another, ways in which students can do that. But annotating the text is a really important aspect of all of this, because it helps to focus students on what it is that they understand, what the connections that they're making, and what they're finding confusing. And that's an important part of doing a close reading. Whenever I am initially doing a close reading, I ask students to circle the things that are confusing to all of them. And it's twofold. Certainly there's a process for them of, there's a metacognitive process of them beginning to notice what it is that they find confusing. That's certainly of value. But it also is helpful for me as a teacher, because when students are annotating on text, I can walk around and I can see what it is that they are finding confusing. I can look at their annotations or glance at them in any case. And for me, it becomes like this really informal assessment where I can begin to figure out what my next teaching moves are going to be. I don't know what they find confusing when they're reading silently to themselves. But when I get them to annotate, now there's a behavior I can observe, and that's really useful. I also want to pay attention to the patterns of what it is that they are noting, either in the notes that they're writing to themselves, the connections that they're making, or if I'm seeing a pattern among students where a lot of them seem to be noting that something is confusing, or that they're making similar kinds of observations. I want to look for those patterns along the way, because those patterns tell me one of two things. If I'm seeing a lot of students making similar kinds of connections, I don't need to spend time on helping them to arrive at those connections. I can also look at, as I said, what they're finding either to be important, they're underlining things, or highlighting things, as it were, or perhaps they're circling things that they're finding confusing. Those patterns tell me something about what it is that's happening with my students. And I guess this is, as much as anything, something that I continually have to remind myself, that it's okay to let them struggle. It's okay for that to happen. I think, again, I think that we have become accustomed to removing all struggle from our students. But the problem with that is that they don't know how to struggle when they're faced with doing it all by themselves, if that makes any sense. There's a persistence, and there is a stamina, and there is a habit of mind that comes from having lots of experiences where you have struggled for a time and you have overcome. And if we don't allow that struggle to happen, and then an opportunity for them to move past that struggle to deepen their understanding, then they don't know what to do whenever they're faced with a difficult piece of text and there's nobody around to scaffold for them. Then they don't have that persistence in order to go forward. So I have to remind myself sometimes it really is okay if the kids struggle a little bit. During the last webinar that we did, we talked about text-dependent questions, and certainly that's a key part of what happens in any kind of close reading. But just as a reminder about what text-dependent questions are, a chief way that we get students to reread text, because that's what close reading really is about multiple readings. We've got a boatload of research on the value of rereading. That's really what happens with close reading, is that you're getting them to reread and to discuss and to write about what it is that they know. If I ask text-dependent questions, questions that drive them back into the text, I am causing them to reread. So as a simple example and non-example, if I'm looking at the preamble for the Declaration of Independence, I can ask a non-text-dependent question, like what would you do if you were present at the signing of the Declaration of Independence? That is a non-text-dependent question. And you know, all the 12-year-olds are going to tell me what it was that they would do if they were at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and I'm sure we'd have a very entertaining conversation, but 10 or 12 or 15 minutes later, those students would be no closer to understanding that document. On the other hand, I can ask a text-dependent question. What are the reasons that are listed in the preamble for supporting the argument to separate from Great Britain? Other people have called the Declaration of Independence the greatest breakup letter ever. And it certainly is laid out there in the preamble. In fact, they give 26 or 27 reasons why they're going to leave Great Britain. And that's not to say that there isn't value in the first question. What would you do if you were present at the signing? That is of value. My argument is that that question and the student responses that come from it are richer and deeper and more informed after we've built a strong foundation of understanding what the document is. So now, if I hold that question in abeyance until after they understand the document much more clearly, now I'm not getting the responses of a 12-year-old. I'm getting the responses of a young historian who is thinking about the source, thinking about the context of the time, and giving some consideration to what he or she might have done in that same situation, understanding that the signers were risking their livelihoods and their lives in being able to sign this document. So text-dependent questions are a way of getting students to reread and to discuss and to enrich and deepen their understanding so that we can ask other questions that move beyond the text but that are informed by the text. Now I'll talk with you about a study that we just recently did. My colleagues and I did here at our school, Health Sciences High in Middle College. And it was in looking at the use of close readings to be able to support writing instruction. Now this is actually a much larger study, and we've got about 8 months worth of information and data on all of this, and we have not analyzed all of it. But I'll talk with you about one lesson as a way of being able to instruct this. What happens in a close reading is that you're reading multiple times. I mean, that's really the basis of all of this. And these were our 9th graders. And this particular close reading used the poem Still I Rise by Maya Angelou. And so in any lesson, of course, you're setting the purpose. Here's what you're going to learn about today, and here's what it is that I want you to do with it. And so we moved on from there. And during that first reading, we had them read independently and silently. Did a little bit of pre-reading, you know, just to kind of get them warmed up to the task, but not much. And we had them read the text and annotate it. They know about circling and underlining and those sorts of things. We've taught them some coding systems. And posed a couple of text-dependent questions to them and had them discussing it as a large class, as a whole class, also doing some partner talking, and then doing some writing. And this is typically the way that we do a close reading. It's a combination of all of those things. And our initial questions were pretty tied to not only to the text, but also fairly basic, because this is a first reading. We're just going to build some knowledge. So we're asking them, what do you think the main idea of the poem is, and what's your evidence in being able to do so? And What we found is that in looking at the writing as well as the discussions that happened in the classes, and these were, as I said, about 150 ninth graders, most of them were certainly able to recognize that the author was treated badly, but most of them did not come to this conclusion or understand that this poem was really about rising above diversity. They also indicated that they knew that the author was African American, but they didn't use any text evidence. And as we had our class discussions, we recognized that most kids knew who Maya Angelou was because she's been on Oprah. She's Oprah's friend, so they knew that. Two of the students didn't even, I mean, they were way off of the mark and thought that this was about, you know, dating and relationship abuse and those sorts of things. But that's our first reading. And what we did was we analyzed that data and compared it to where it was that students were performing after that first reading. These are ninth graders, and we found that they were really at the 6th grade level during that first reading, that was the complexity of their thinking. Here's an example of one of the students after that first reading, after some whole group discussion that was led by the teacher as well as some partner talk, and she's got some pretty basic writing that's there. She's cited some textual evidence, but it's not terribly complex thinking that's going on in this case. We also compared all of their writing samples to the writing standards and found that that overall, students after that first reading were writing at about a 5th grade standard. So in other words, after that first reading, these ninth graders were reading at about a 6th grade level and writing at about a 5th grade level. That was the level of sophistication that was happening. But with a close reading, remember, you're purposefully identifying a complex piece of text, and you want them to go back to it again and again and again to deepen their knowledge. So here comes the second reading, all right? So now we're going to read it again, and again, those text-dependent questions drive them back into the text. So asking them questions, for example, around phrases or lines that could be compared to one another, looking for context clues, and again, thinking about what it is that the author is trying to tell the world. Now understand that a different way, a more conventional way of teaching this poem would be to go ahead and tell them during the pre-reading that this poem is all about rising above adversity. We didn't do that during the pre-reading. We're helping students to discover this themselves. Again, they did the same, similar kinds of things, classroom discussion, talking with partners, writing notes, and this time the teacher also read aloud 2 of the standards and thought aloud about the author's message. So now they're getting multiple readings that are happening. And what we found in looking at the transcripts from those discussions were that more students were starting to cite evidence, more students were understanding that this was about adversity and overcoming it, more students were beginning to identify what the author's purpose was. In other words, that they were now moving after this second round of reading to an 8th grade standard in their reading comprehension. Now, the students didn't get smarter between the first reading and the second reading. They didn't get more skilled at being able to read. But what they did get was more time to be able to think deeply about a complex piece of text with a skilled teacher who was leading those conversations. Same student, this is Daniela, now after her second reading. She's got more writing that's going on now. She's beginning to cite more evidence. There's a higher degree of sophistication in terms of what it is that she understands. I love that she pulled out the line, because I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room, and interpreting all of that. So we're seeing some growth that's happening here. In analyzing the students' written responses after the second reading, we identified them primarily at about the 7th grade during this second round of writing that was going on. So deepening in sophistication. So after this second reading, now they're reading at an 8th grade level and they're writing at about a 7th grade level. But remember, these are 9th graders. We want them reading and writing at a higher level than that. And so now we're going into that third round of the reading. And the text-dependent questions are becoming more sophisticated and are drawing on more levels of inference and evaluation. I love this question. Why is "and" so important in the line, "and still I rise"? How come the poet doesn't say "still I rise"? She says "and still I rise." Why is that important? Why is that little word, "and," so important in this poem? And what are the lessons or the themes? Again, going back to all of that. After the third reading, what we found was that, again, students were becoming much more sophisticated in their understanding. After the third reading, this is where we started to see students making connections to history, understanding that a history of slavery and the ancestry of the poet's family played a big part in the creation of this poem. We didn't teach history in that lesson. They had that information, but it took them a while to be able to find it. It took them a while to be able to get to all of that. Now, when we analyzed, again, the transcripts from the student conversations, the student discussions, now we're starting to see them demonstrating the kind of thinking and analysis that's called for at their grade level. But it took several experiences. It took an extended amount of time to get there. They didn't get there on the very first reading. They needed time and practice with being able to do this. We also found when we looked at their writing that their writing was now moving to the 9th grade level as well. Again, we're just talking about the analysis of all of this. But what was really important to us was that we saw students performing at grade level after we had done this close reading. Here's Daniela's writing after the third reading that's going on. Again, she's really expanded what it was that she was able to do. This is the same kid whose writing you saw a few minutes ago as well, but she understands so much more. Close reading is really about building their habits in being able to approach complex pieces of text and be able to understand and do this kind of cognitive work when you're not standing around and you're not there to help them with all of that. So some of the conclusions that we came to in terms of this small portion of the study were that those text-dependent questions were absolutely essential to those repeated close readings because they drove students back into the text. Those text-dependent questions supported their analysis of the text. We saw progression at deeper and deeper levels. And in their writing, we saw that there was progressively this more academic tone that was taken on, more complexity of ideas, better use of academic language and vocabulary along the way. Close reading is not just about finding a bunch of pieces of text and torturing children with them. It really is about causing them to be able to engage in the kind of sophisticated thinking that they are capable of doing but have rarely been asked to do along the way. We've seen tremendous growth with our students in being able to engage in this practice. And so with that, I wanted to make sure to leave a few minutes for some questions and answers.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nancy. This is a great presentation, very informative, and I'm pretty sure that it's going to be very helpful and very useful to be applied. We're going to move on to the, like Nancy said, question and answer session. Remember, you can place your questions on the chat box in your control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And I have the first question here. So here it goes, Nancy. What does closed reading look like with younger children?
That's a great question, because you're exactly right. You know, if you're teaching at kindergarten or first or second grade, first of all, you're not doing Still I Rise. You're not doing Maya Angelou poems. So certainly the materials are changing, but also the practices are changing too. One of the things that I had noted in my description of a lesson with older students is that we started with some independent reading that was going on. That's not likely to occur whenever you've got younger children that are happening. My colleague Doug Fisher and I did an article that's in this month's reading teacher that's called Close Reading in Elementary Schools. And we looked exactly at that particular issue and looked at it in the company of a number of elementary teachers and instructional coaches to be able to examine that very topic. And one of the practices that we came to discover with them as well was that very often your close readings in elementary school, especially in the primary grades, are going to be much more around the use of read-alouds and shared readings. Students are not necessarily doing a lot of independent reading of those books. The capacity to think in sophisticated ways is there, but it has not. But their reading skills have not yet caught up to that sophisticated thinking, and so we have to bridge those reading skills for those emergent and early readers, and we do so by doing read-alouds and shared readings. You also may find, if you're working with younger children, that you have to do a bit more front-loading. And again, thinking about the role of pre-reading, when you've got very young readers, of course you're doing more of that pre-reading than you would do with older readers, comparatively speaking. Younger readers are not necessarily as practiced at being able to activate their own background knowledge. And then finally, there are differences around annotation. I really find that annotation is incredibly valuable, but you're not going to have first graders necessarily writing all over the text, if you will. But think about annotation more broadly. I used to be an elementary teacher, and a lot of the books that we would use would be the big books. And annotation with a big book with very young readers can be things like putting a wiki stick, you know, which are those sticky sticks, if you will, that you can bend and stick right onto the paper. Annotation can be the use of wiki sticks on a big book. Come on up here and put a wiki stick around the word that best describes how the farmer feels in this on this page, for instance. That's what annotation may look like. As well, annotation may look like what it is that the teacher's doing. In other words, the teacher is the one that is annotating on the text. Putting a piece of text on a document camera and showing students how it is that you make notes can be incredibly powerful. So you may be taking on the role of annotation with those younger students. So 3 things that I talked about. Using that your close readings are probably going to be more around read-alouds and shared readings because the sophistication of the text and what students are able to read, there's a bigger gap that's happening there. The second is that you may be doing a bit more front-loading, and the third is that your annotation practices are going to look a bit different as well.
Great. Nancy, we have time for one more question, and here's the final question. It says, how can we get the PowerPoint and article you mentioned?
The article is in this month's reading teacher. I'm looking to see what the issue is. So I guess that's the December issue of the reading teacher. If you're a member of the International Reading Association, you can get it online for free. If you are a student in a university program, you can also get that as well for free. If you're having difficulty in being able to find it, go ahead and send me an email and I will track it down for you. And I'll go ahead and I'll give you my email address. Are you ready? It's N as in Nancy, N Frey, F-R-E-Y, at mail, M-A-I-L, dot S-D-S-U, San Diego State University, dot E-D-U. And if you email me and ask me about that, I'll make sure to get that to you. In terms of the PowerPoint, am I right that the PowerPoint is going to be available on the Sadlier website? Where do you
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And if you like, it could also, this is being recorded, so we can also email it to you directly.
Perfect.
So that's fantastic. And Nancy, actually, we do have more time for one more question, and here it goes. Some high school teachers complain that it takes too much time. For example, at a recent training, a teacher said, "I can't spend 15 minutes on the Gettysburg's address no more. Sigh." How do you respond?
I think Abraham Lincoln would be very disappointed to know that we can't spend 15 minutes on the Gettysburg Address, which I think is a little bit, maybe that's a little bit of a facetious or flip answer, but I don't know how to not have time to be able to do this. I think that, that one of the tensions that we're feeling in our profession is that there has been such an emphasis on reading volume that that we're having a hard time pulling back from all of that. But reading volume essentially is accomplished whenever you're able to teach students to be able to read in more sophisticated ways on their own. When they're with me in the classroom and we're at school, I want to spend time looking more closely at more complex pieces of literature so that I can build their capacity to be able to do so on their own outside of my presence. I think it's also important to note that close reading is in no way the only kind of reading practice or literacy practices that there are. Of course, I am still doing read-alouds. Of course, I'm still doing shared readings. Of course, students are reading independently as well. But what I have found is that the guided instruction that comes with me taking a short, complex passage and spending time doing that pays off in terms of what students are able to do away from me.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much, Nancy. Thank you for this great presentation. Thank you for sharing it with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for
all
having
the
me.
attendants for assisting this webinar. Please attend to our following one and have yourself a great afternoon. Nancy, have a great one. Thank you so much.